So what are fields? We break it down to its very basic components. It's just a type of information, whether that's a text field, a date, a color, a pictogram. It's really breaking down the information into its finest points. It's designed to capture the component parts of a sign. So are we talking room number, room names, all those different pieces that become, build the sign as a whole. Uh, Now we also talk about how much information is enough, because again, you can get infinitely expressive when it comes to these fields. You can have as many fields as you want, but that we don't want you to create more work for yourself. So we want to try and find the right balance, and that's one thing we're going to be exploring with the examples that we have coming up. So why do we create fields to begin with? Again, it comes all back to flexibility and searchability. All right, we want to make sure that what you're doing in SignAgent is, you're not redoing information, redoing your sign types over and over and over again to create, an infinite number of sign types. And we also want the information that you've put into your signs to be able to be searchable instead of, searching large blocks of text. We're looking for something specific. Fields also assist in automation with generating templated artwork and the automatic artwork generation that SignAgent has built into it. We also find that problems are a lot easier to fix. Say, for example, if you are looking to go ahead and find a spelling mistake, it's easier to change a spelling mistake on one field than it is, you're affecting the entire layout of a sign. It also helps you dictate the standards that you've been given by your clients or given to your designers accurately as possible, right? So we're breaking it down into those core components. So we're preserving that information that comes from the sign standards and keeping it in SignAgent, and your vision is intact. It also allows you to improve with scale. So, whether or not you have 200 signs or 2,000 signs, it's going to make sure that the information is constrained and only the right information is going to be present. And that also lends itself to long-term functionality. So the nice thing is because that information is preserved in the system, you can come back to your preserved sign standards 6 months down the road, a year down the road, and that information is going to be accessible and available and in a format that you can depend on. So how does it work? And how much work is it to actually do this? In most cases, we're looking at about 10 to 15 minutes of your time. So for example, we're looking at this room ID sign. We have some very basic components. We have the room number, we have a Braille translation, we have the room name, and then we also have the color for the upper part of the sign. So that's really only four pieces that tend to be variable, and creating that is not very difficult and not very time consuming. Now, we can get on the other end of the spectrum, especially when we're talking about templating and generating this artwork automatically for you. We now see we have multiple columns, multiple rows, and variable information such as that on level 4 there, that the highlight of the blue color, or even at the bottom where you see multiple icons within that text. That becomes very complicated, but absolutely doable, and that will take you a few hours to complete. If you just want to preserve the messaging information, so you know what, I want to know what each row says, it's probably going to take you about 10 minutes to preserve that information easily. So what field does what field does a sign type need? Well, we're going to help you break that down. So really, there's 4 pieces of information that we want you to consider when doing this. So what information on that sign type is variable? What's going to be changing from one sign type to another sign type? If this sign type has a number, this one has a pictogram, you're obviously going to want to have multiple different sign types for that. We want to preserve what's searchable. right? What characteristics do you want to be searchable on this? So is that the name of the room? Is that, whatever fields that you want to be included there? Is the information updatable? So what large chunks of this information do you want to update on a regular basis? Is this going to help you preserve this information, 6 months down the road if you have a renovation coming up and this sign's going to be changing to, a different type of room? You can preserve that and make that easily changeable. And then again, are there any special considerations that we need to make when we're doing the automatic templating generation? Now, we're going to get into some specific details here. I'd like to introduce Alex, and he'll take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. Um, so appreciate everybody here. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to talk about this just in a little bit more depth. So the first thing that Jeff mentioned was variability. What changes from one sign to another? And for this, we're actually going to take a look at some real standards and start breaking this down kind of as we would if we were setting this up in the system. So what we want to think about, and I'm going to bring up a more zoomable version of this, is when we're looking at this artwork, what are the things that change from one sign to another? So easy part is we have text that is going to be different from one sign to another. Great. So we're going to create a text field. Now, emergency department and security are using the same rules. They're the same size, they're the same color, they're the same typeface. However, A&E for A&E reception here is using a different set of rules. We have now a larger piece of text, and so we might want to capture that independently. We'll definitely want to do that if we're thinking about templating at any point. And so we now have two. We're going to not super creatively call them like text and our large text for this. Looking over a little further, we also have a symbol that needs to come into play here. So we've got our text, but we also want to be able to drop in an icon. We've now got a third field of information that can be used in this sign. Then the background elements here. The background color is going to change from sign to sign, and that's going to happen sometimes independently of what we'll call like a footer color. So background color, footer color, we're now up to 5 different fields to capture all the information on this sign. Now, there's one other piece that we're going to focus on, which is in this sign, depending on the length of message, we use differing point sizes for that text. And so we know that when there is only that text, so maybe not our large text, but just for text, we have the option to have 4 different sizes that we need to specify. And so keeping track of that now brings us up to 6 variable pieces of information that are going to change from one sign to another, all within this sign type. So let's look at actually setting that up. I'm going to pull this up here. And when we look at this, it is going to be everything that we just listed. So I'm going to recreate that A&E sign from the standards document here. And we can see we have that large text, we have reception. There wasn't a symbol on it, but we have the option of including one if there is. We've got our background and footer color, and then we have what is called our ITP text size, where we have the 4 different options of text size that we can work with on this one. We also may want to include other things that are variable. I have just a simple example here of what material this sign is. So whether it's acrylic or aluminum, it can be anything that we desire. Common things to include in details are mounting, power considerations, even condition of a sign if we're managing things long term. For the moment, though, let's take those variable pieces and talk about how we came up with the names for those. I know they were pretty generic, but when do we want to have things be named just text, and when do we want them to have them be a little bit more specific? So we want to be generic by default. Generally, we want to cast a wide net. We want to have lots of information under a particular field and not necessarily tie it to specific types of signs. So the destination that a overhead wayfinding sign points to should be the same destination field that a wall-mounted wayfinding sign points to. However, we've got room name here. That's generic. We'll say, for example, every room ID type sign that we have in a standard is probably going to in some way have a room name field included on it because that's a pretty common piece of information for those signs. Same thing with symbol. It's a wide term. We might have lots of individual pictograms, but they can be used in a pretty flexible way. And so we just say this is our symbol field because we know that this sign has a symbol showing up on it. When we want to get more granular, though, is when the information gets a little more specific. So, for example, instead of just using room name, on restroom signs, we might have a specific field called restroom name. The idea behind this, though, is there's really only a few options for the text that is going to show up on those signs. We might have women's, men's, all gender. And because we have that narrow set of options, we are going to isolate them off so that we can automate them a little bit. We want this to be a drop down. We don't want to have to worry about spelling mistakes. And we want this to be easily searchable. And so we break this off as its own field just so that it is a little bit more controlled because the information is a little bit more specific. The arrow, same example. Instead of just using symbol, when we're talking about those wayfinding signs, when I am selecting what arrow I want, I don't want my symbol for where the cafeteria is or the ER or whatever it might be. I want just a list of arrows. And so with that, we tend to want a specific field to account for those arrows. Now, the most specific example I have at the bottom here is actually one of the things that comes up the least, which is when we tie a field to a very specific sign type. And the reason that we're doing that, if we flip back to this sign here, is when we are looking at this, the ITP has 4 different sizes of text that we can use. There may be other signs, so let's say our VLO7 here may also have different text sizes, but we don't want those 2 sets of information to get muddled together because the VLO7, let's say, has 160 point as an acceptable thing. We don't ever want to make that an option to be selected by the ITP. And so with this is when we want to get specific, right? This one sign has very specific options, and so we actually tie the field to that sign. All right, so we're going to move on then to the next step here. Before we do, just wanted to make sure we haven't had any questions yet. If anyone's having any trouble in the Q&A, let us know. It might be a little challenging to do so, but feel free to submit anything that's coming up, or just say that, we're doing such a fantastic job that it's all perfectly clear and there's no questions, which, would be amazing if that was the case. So after we've decided on everything that's variable, we might want to look for things that are searchable because the two are not necessarily the same. In this example of this sign standard that we're looking at, the actual content of this regulatory sign, barring the floor number that it's on, is static. It's the same every single time. And so this might not be anything that we need to program into a message schedule. This is just one sign, and it always looks this way. However, when we look at that, I'm going to pull one of these up. If we just put in this artwork, when I create this marker, it drops this sign. Are we good to go? Maybe. Sometimes, though, we might want to think about how to make this a little bit more searchable. If I am updating every non-smoking icon across, my sign standard, how do I know that this icon is used on this sign? Right now, I don't have a way of doing that. And so if I think that at some point I may want to be able to search for this kind of information, we want to make sure that it has a field. And so what we do there is, again, even though it's not variable from one sign, from one VLO7 to another VLO7 sign, what we do is we set up the fields for this so that this information can now be found within the system. So, for example, we've got the regulatory no smoking here. All of this information we've set up as a default, so it's inherited automatically. We set this up one time, it took a few minutes, but now every sign we create of this type automatically comes in with this information in a searchable way. And so let's see that in action. We're going to turn on all of these signs, both the non-searchable and the searchable. And when I do a search for regulatory no smoking, the only one that pops up is the information that we've put in fields so that it can be found and discovered. Now, this doesn't just apply to the fields either. We may want to let this inform how we break information down. So, for example, we have in this sign, we have something just for dimensions as the details about it. And the default is, it's 20 by 26. However, if at some point we expect we might want to search for all of our signs that are 20 inches wide, or we might want to search specifically for height, that's a sign that we want to break that information apart. Again, when we isolate information, it's a little bit more searchable and it's a little bit more prescriptive. And so if we were to do that for this same sign and we wanted more searchable height, we can do a few things. First, we break it into height and width. And then the actual content that we put in, we say, the width is 20 inches versus the height is 26. And we do that so that we have very searchable terminology. Just saying 20 inches, if I did a search for 20 inches, I would get everything that has 20 inches in it. If I do specifically W-20, then I get only the signs that have a width of 20 inches. And so this may or may not be applicable, but it's what we want to think about when it comes to how we're structuring our data is not just what changes, but what in the future are we going to want to isolate? What are we going to want to find? And as an extension for that comes the next thing that we want to be taking a look at, which is this updatable? So this actually doesn't make it super clear. Let's go straight into the example here. This comes back to what Jeff was saying at the beginning, where we are looking at a sign as folks typically have the instinct to set them up when first starting in the software, where we just have a directional sign and on side one, we put all of the information that it says. On side two, we drop in all of the information there as well. Now, this is absolutely going to generate a message schedule. This works. This is, totally a way that we can do this. However, if we want this to be easily updated in bulk, this becomes hard. For example, if I search for cleaning closet, this sign will pop up. It will find it. However, every sign has a different block of text because we've put it all together. And so I am going to have to manually go in and make any updates if we, for example, changed what this was supposed to say across the board. And so if we want to have something not only be searchable, but also easily updatable, again, we want to isolate that. And we want not just to have its own field, but also its own entry into that field. So what that looks like in this example is we've actually broken this down a little bit more. We've gone and we've said, here are the arrows, here are the destinations, here are the symbols. But we've also said within side one, we have our column 1 facing to the left, currently empty. We have our column 2 facing to the right, which we've put this information in. And we have our cleaning closet. Now, because this is our separated, isolated piece of information, it's easily updated. So what that looks like is if we come up to our manage messages, I can do a search. Let's just go for everything in the destinations. Here we go. Cleaning closet is its own isolated thing. And so when I check how many signs it's linked to, here's the 5 signs that shows up on. And regardless of where that shows up on the sign, if I make a change here, that change now ripples out to all of those signs. I don't have to go through and manually update anything. I made one change and it affects it everywhere. This, again, is, as Jeff said, something that scales with size. The more signs we have, the faster and more time saving we get out of doing this kind of structure. It only takes one large scale change where something shifts partway through a project for it to suddenly be worth it for the ability to update all of the storage closets in one go, especially if we are also using any kind of templated art, because that now is a change that renders automatically and quickly across the entire system. Okay, so we've gone through what changes, what do we want to find, what do we want to update. The last thing, and it's not one we can go into super deep depth on, is what do we want to be automatable? When it comes to templating artwork, there are certain considerations and just ways that templates work that means that we have to adjust the way that we're setting up our fields. There's a lot to this, and we don't unfortunately have time to get into it all today. But just as an example, let's go back to that very first ITP type sign that we were looking at, and say that we did want to start templating this artwork later on. Now, when we look at this for the artwork, everything is pretty much the same. We still have all of these same fields. There's one change, which is now what text size we're using is coming from the uploaded template rather than an individual field. And so this is to highlight that if we do this kind of setup, if we do break the information down this way, and we decide later that, hey, we want to automate things and we want this artwork to generate, we've already done all the hard work. All of the fields that we set up are still relevant, good information. We've isolated them so that the template can refer to them and know that, this particular message in this size is what we're going to find in text large. I don't have to break A and E reception apart. And so let's say that you have a couple hundred signs that are affected. Because you've already done all of the work of separating this out, this becomes a really easy step to take on. Okay, so that's everything that we want to think about when it makes coming up with the fields for a sign type. Let's go the other direction. Let's talk about how these fields can affect what is a sign type in the system. And so the general rule is always if there's a code in the sign standard, it equals a sign type in SignAgent. That's a great starting point, and it may never get more complicated than that. However, like with everything in signage, there's a lot of ways to do this. And so what we're going to talk about here is not here's how you have to do this work. This is things to think about and decisions that you can make depending on what you're looking for. So we'll start with when we want to combine signs. So we may have two different sign types in the standard. However, if they have similar layout and similar function, they may be a candidate to combine into one sign type in the system. And so this is an example of that, where we have two different restroom signs, and the difference between them is whether it's accessible or non-accessible. Everything else is the same. We still have room numbers using all the same rules. We have those room names. We have the braille. All the sizing is the same. Only really what changes is whether we are using an accessible icon or not. And so if we wanted to combine this, what that ends up looking like is this RR sign type here, where when I come in, it has all of those fields that we just talked about. It says what the room number is. It's got the restroom type that translated into Braille. And for the symbol, we actually just have the accessible version and the non-accessible version all within here, right? Whether it's accessible or not depends on which icon we choose. However, it may still be worthwhile to actually be able to search by this information, right? We still may want to make the distinction. It just may not come up often enough to be worth having two completely different types of signs for it. And so what we do is we say, created a detail field. This now designates that when we are using the accessible icon, we say, yes, this is accessible. And so we can search for all of our accessible washroom signs just by isolating down to our RR and doing a search for yes, accessible. Um, and so we haven't lost any information. Everything that we wanted to be able to search for, to divide by, to report on is still there. But because they were so similar, we were able to combine them. And whether or not we want to do that really comes down to how often we're wanting to split up this information. In this example that we're drawing from, working with someone, they didn't need to run that accessibility report very often, and so we just put it all under one banner, and it was available when they needed it. Now, let's talk about the reverse. If we have a sign standard and it has quite a few different functions and layouts, and most importantly, is potentially hard to program, that's a sign that we may want to split them into multiple types of signs just to cover this one standard here. Now, what does hard to program mean? What we typically do is think about how many fields do we need, and on any individual sign, how many of those fields are we leaving blank in order to properly program it? If there are lots of fields and we often have to leave them blank, it's a sign that we may want to split this up because it's not necessarily intuitive. You've got to know a little bit more about how the system works and what the design intent is. It's harder to just jump in and get it right on the first time. And so let's take a look at this. Before splitting this sign, we have our text, sorry, let me go look at that example for a second again here. We have our text. We have our text 2 that is unbolded. We also have that bold text translated into Spanish. We have a symbol, and that symbol can be two different sizes. And the rules for the text size, the color and opacity versus the other messages mean that there's a lot of things that shift with this sign, and that can be okay. However, there's kind of a delineation here between all of the just text only signs use roughly the same set of rules, similar sized messaging, and only messaging, and then the icons have a different function as well as they have extra information and different rules around the text that actually is there. And so that seems like a good point at which we can start splitting things. So coming back to this again, we have these fields. We have text, text to, text Spanish, symbol, and layout. And there are 4 different layouts here of what we might want to be working with. And so this is fine. This will absolutely cover a wide standard, but it is an option to think about splitting it to make things easier for ourselves. So let's look at text or just the symbol. When we do this, there are fewer fields, and most importantly, we're not leaving them blank most of the time. So on every text-only sign, if this was all combined, we'd leave the symbol blank. Now, when we do work with this, we've got all this information here, the translation's coming through automatically. The only thing we have to select is whether we're using the small symbol or the large symbol. On the other side, we have the text-only version, and again, we have some fields that are sometimes left blank. When we are using 2 messages, we are not going to be putting in a Spanish translation, right? This is totally in English. However, there's fewer things that are left blank. It's a little bit more intuitive to work with, where we're saying, okay, are we working with 2 messages or are we working with only the Spanish? And so whether we're templating this or not can still be accounted for in the sign. It's just the interface gets a little bit easier to work with. So there's always a balancing point. Sometimes it's nice to split things up. At a certain point, if we make everything too granular, we don't have that many examples of that sign. It's more work. And frankly, our sign type list on the left gets to be longer than anyone can keep track of. So it's always a trade-off between, how specific we want to get versus how easy is it to sort through all this information. And I would love to say that there's always one answer, but it depends. Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit here and talk about the few different levels of field setup. So the three that we have are basic information capture. This is when we are not capturing pretty much most things about what the message says. We've got where we capture all of the message schedule, and then we have where we add in some of those extra details that allow us to template the artwork. So basic information capture often refers more to the details of the signs. They um, are going to be about kind of what is actually physically there. So things like sign size, what the material is, we're not necessarily saying what the actual content of that sign says. This is where we want to start with information. This is ideally, if we're especially, whether you are managing your signs long term, this is not a very flexible option, so it means more manual work to do so. Or if you are working for a client, this means that we do not have information that is as repeatable, as flexible, and we're not handing off as good of a product. However, sometimes before the work ever starts in SignAgent, a full message schedule is already done. We have proofs. And so at that point, maybe this is all that we want to do. It's not worth it to duplicate all that work in the system. Anytime, though, that you're not in that situation, setting up these fields is almost always a worthwhile endeavor. So let's just start with that version 1 here. So you can see that if we think about that artwork that we were looking at, and actually let me pull that up here. We have a sign that changes sizes. It refers to gates and levels. It's got differing artwork for different kinds of arrows coming in. It's got a few icons that pop in as necessary. So there's a lot of moving pieces to this sign about what it's going to say. But if we're just focusing on bare bones information capture, all of that doesn't really matter. We are worrying about what the height, width of the sign is, how it's mounted, and maybe in this case, just as an example, we have status. Is this temporary with a scheduled removal? Is it permanent? What are we doing? So then let's go to the next level up, which is now we care about the message schedule. And so we're going to open this one and we are going to see that we are now capturing all of the original details, but also the content. So just the way we broke it down in when we were looking at that updatable version of a sign, we've got things that only show up once on the sign, and then we have all of our destination information that's going to show up multiple times. So this is a little bit simpler because we're not accounting for potentially the difference if we zoom right in on this. Is there a difference in layout between check-in 7 to 8 and South Security? There is because this one has a different shift and it's occurring in a different place relative to this pictogram. The 7 and 8 for gates is larger, and so we still will isolate that information, but we may not have as much detail here. That's totally okay. This will make a great message schedule. This is still all the flexibility that we were talking about. And this is where we would almost always recommend we get to when it comes to programming messaging in the system. The investment of time to set this up is pretty minimal compared to the ease of working with it later on. Then we come to the templating. Again, it's very similar to what we already had in that messaging only version. We just have a couple of extra pieces of information that we need to account for. So we are saying what color our arrows are because we have color changing arrows that are going to shift from one sign to another. We start including things like whether there's a divider there just to force that into the system. And we do a little bit more of a breakdown between our destinations and what we're calling sub-destinations, where we have two pieces of messaging associated with this one repeat or one row in the sign. All of this, plus the fact that the dimensions have now moved up into an actual automated part. So this won't fit. It's too big, but we'll do it anyways. Now when we re-render this at a different width, that's coming from the template rather than from anything that we put into the fields. So there's some small changes, but again, not a major shift from the previous way of doing it to accounting for all of this artwork change. And so whether you are planning to actually do this full setup with artwork or not, that broken down field setup is a really worthwhile endeavor to go through. So, in summary, to just wrap up really quickly here, when we're going through this, when we look at a specific sign type, what we want to think about is what changes from one sign to the other, what we want to be able to find later, what we then want to be able to update easily later, and finally, if we are doing templated artwork, what we want to be able to make that artwork happen. And if you go through those kind of 4 steps when we're thinking about every type of sign that we create, you're going to have a great end product that means that you have a lot of flexibility and can hopefully easily account for any changes in standard, in messaging, midway through any project without getting too phased by it. We'll move into some questions now.
Hi, everyone. I'm Larissa from the customer success team working alongside with Alex, Jeff, and Emily. Thank you for joining us today. I just have a couple of questions that I'm going to ask our team, see if we can get some answers. So the first one here is about linking message fields. So the question is if it's possible to link messages from fields from different sign types. For example, could fields in a sign type for an index take the names of identification signs of the same location into account?
Gotcha. It's a great question. Unfortunately, it's not something that we can do. The reason for that is just for the way data works when it goes wrong. If you delete that original sign, what do we do with the messaging that's currently on that other one? Or if you change it in one place, the general rule in SignAgent is because some folks are managing tens of thousands of signs, we don't want to make a change in one spot affect things that you weren't necessarily expecting it to elsewhere. That said, there are ways that we can account for this. I don't know that I have a good example here, but there are things like the searchable sign here where we had those inherited values where every time I create a VL07, oh, I think I misspelled that. Oh, it's an actual 0. Whenever I create one of these signs, it automatically populates with information. If it is location based, we have something called inherited fields where when I edit the location, either the entire location or we can create a zone within that location, we can specify that this is going to be a level 5 when we drop that sign down. So there are ways to get close to that. Unfortunately, it's not a full feature that we're talking about.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. We did have a few questions regarding text size fields. Would you be able to circle back and discuss that in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, absolutely. That was specifically around the regulatory, or was that when I was showing
I'm gonna
artwork that changed size?
take a look because we had a couple of questions here.
Okay,
Um,
let's
Let me take a look, see if I have a specific one.
and you know what? I can also just start with this. So if I don't cover everything, apologies, and we'll touch a little bit more on this in a second. So when we are looking at one of these signs, for example, let's strip this down and just worry about this reception. So the the templated version of this is using a feature called options in our templates to basically draw this sign multiple times, or at least an element of it multiple times, using different rules, and then we select which rule we want to use. So when setting up this template, text as a field, I actually drew it 4 different times, and we labeled it saying which set of rules do we want to use for this, so that when we select 130, we now actually have a different, I guess that's a pretty small change that's hard to see, but we actually have a different set of rules embedded within that template that that sign is now using. If we are just talking about this in the absence of templated artwork, this becomes, a pretty specific field where we are almost saying that we have text and then we have the modification field of that text. So rather than saying that this is just 150 point in brackets after that, we're cluttering up our message schedule a little bit. And we also might, again, not be able to now search by this information. How many signs are not just using our standard 120 point? This becomes a hard thing to find if it's all grouped together. So we actually say that in this, our green room is modified by this field here where we're saying what is the size of this. And the reason we do this is simply we don't have the artwork automated to go based off. And so we need to make this its own field of information for that. And so this is only applicable if you are not templating. But this same logic can apply to a lot of things. If we want to say that the color of a destination changes from one to another in our, where was it? Here we go. Oh, I think it was the to line. There we go. In this, we can have one field that modifies another. So for example, destination says passive observation, but we can have a field called text color where we can then modify what color passive observation is based off that information. Hopefully that makes sense. We can always circle back to this as well.
No, that's great. Thanks, Alex. Another question here is about a kind of master list of signs. So I'll just read it out here. If there's a set of master signs that are used for a client with multiple projects, can the master set be modified with all of these specific fields and then applied to signs that are in the other projects?
Gotcha. So when we are talking about projects, projects are going to live within this one organization. So if we are, a vendor for our clients, what we tend to want to do is to keep the organization where, sorry, let me try that again. We're going to keep all of the information for that client under one organization. Now, this organization can have lots of projects, both open and closed, but as long as that client is using the same sign standards in all of them, we should keep all of that information together. Partially because, if we don't, updating things gets harder. We can't do bulk reports across multiple organizations. We always want to have the information for one sign standard under one organization. Now, that said, if we are already in the position where, client X, we did a project for them here, and then we create another organization with a different project, we do have the ability to import sign types between organizations, not the signs that they are associated with, but just the types, and that will allow you to bring those across. However, they are not linked. Changes that you make in one are not affected in another because organizations are designed to be pretty siloed.
Awesome. Thank you. We do have, I think, one or two more questions here, but we're happy to answer these outside of the webinar, Alex, if you want to kind of move on with the next
Sure.
page here. So for anyone's questions that were not answered, we will follow up with any responses and information after the webinar.
Awesome. Thanks, Larissa. So let's do a really quick breakdown because we've only got 10 minutes and I'd like to go through a few of these just in a little bit less depth. And these are the actual signs that some of you submitted, which I really appreciate here. So let's look at this one. We've got one example, and what we can see when we start looking at this, so let's run through our checklist, is what is variable from one to another. Buildings is potentially always going to be there, and so only if we want this to be a searchable term do we want this to be included as a field. Building number, however, that's probably going to change from one to the other. So there we go. We've got our first field. In this case, it'll say 1 and 2, but it'll change from one sign to the other. We have our west entrance here. So the entrance is probably also something that's going to change from one sign to another and therefore be a field that we want to set up. And then I'm not actually certain if this is building numbers or room numbers, but let's assume that this is just room numbers for the moment. What we would do for this is set this up as a repeating field, but it's its own field all the same. So to do a really quick run through this, if we go and we edit our building type, we would have in our fields section, we would have the building number. It only shows up one time, so it's a standard message field. We would do the entrance. That again only shows up one time, so it's a pretty standard one. And then we would drop down to this repeating section where we want to take a look and say that there are up to 5 different rooms that we can work with. And so I'm going to call that like room range. And there's a maximum of 5 rows of them. And so we've now captured this, at least the things that change. There may be more that we want to search for. There's nothing more than that for templating. But when we now create one of these signs, we are looking at, there we go, a interface that looks like this. So if we created, let me see if I can do a quick reference for everybody to work with here as we do this. So if we are looking at just this sign, we have our buildings number, so we'll do 1 and 2. We've got our full ranges that we'll accomplish there, and then our west entrance under entrance here. And with that, we've hopefully captured most of the information that we care about. And again, it comes in the form of a message schedule that is easy to work with, export, and update. Okay, let's tackle the next one here, which is I believe a parking or a destination sign that has quite a few different variations. And so when we look at this, we want to see where are all the different pieces of information, not just for how they work, but also like what are the rules around these. So I can see just starting off, and we're going to go through them. We've got our arrow that we'll need to include. We have our, what I'll call like our destination. And that covers all these 3 plus this one because that's the same information twice. However, we get down here where it's not a destination. It's not associated with necessarily an arrow. And so we can have a 3rd field for this bold text here. Now, we can use destination potentially for this piece of text here. However, this now becomes a bit of a gray area where, yes, if we were templating this, we could absolutely set this up so that visitor parking and employee parking use the same field, but it is a question of, are they actually the same kind of information? We're pointing someone in this direction versus it's not so much a destination in this case. Whether that's a different field or not is really a personal preference. So we've covered all of those, but that gets also all of these. Again, it's just arrow with more repeats included in it. And then we get down to here, which I think these 2 are the only things that are left, where we have our destination. But in terms of something that changes, it looks like this is a slightly smaller text. And so if we are templating, we absolutely want to break that apart because it's using a different set of rules than everything else we've looked at so far. So destination would be west entrance, but now we need sub-destination for this one. Last thing here is in a very similar way, the field for this one here and this look to be the same, right? They're center justified. They are not so much pointing someone in a direction. And so we can use the field, whatever we're calling it, for those 2 pieces of information and just say it is now also in conjunction with this one here. So that's a lot of pieces. Give me 1 second here and we'll try and really quickly put that together as a sign. So coming in to the system. We'll just call this our parking sign. And we'll start listing off those fields. Now, every one of those that we mentioned may need to show up in the context of having more than one piece of information on a sign. So we'll just stay away from our message fields and we'll focus entirely on our repeating. When I looked there, the most I saw was 3 rows of information. So we now are going to list all of these out. We've got our arrow. We have that destination. So again, when we're talking about this, our destination, we then are going to have a possibility on one row to have again, we're just going to call it like large text because I am not super creative. We then have our sub destination that we talked about. And finally, we have our generic message where it's not pointing someone towards a destination, but it is still a part of how this sign repeats. And so for this, we can include that as a message as well. Now, we did this, and that is to include everything. This is an example, though, where rarely are we ever going to fill out all of that information. And when I create a parking sign, this is going to probably have half of the fields filled, and there's a fair bit of variety in how we do this. And so we may want to split this up. We may want to have informational signs versus wayfinding signs, and then there's one example of a hybrid. So I don't know exactly which way we want to go with that. Again, this isn't a hard rule. It's more of an art form for how you want to work with your information. And I would never want to tell a designer how they have to set things up because you know best. So it's just a matter of weighing all of these for how we would do this, but this is the interface that we're left with if we want to cover everything. I'm going to try and fit in one more in the last couple minutes here, which is just this post sign here. So this is a really interesting example because it's a lot of the things that we were just talking about, but now there's a lot of sides to this. So it looks like we have up to 4 panels of information. Each of those panels can be double-sided. And so we have kind of two-sided sign with up to 4 panels. So how do we account for that? Well, what we would do is we are going to pull up SignAgent here, and I'm going to make this a little bit smaller, so hopefully we can kind of reference that as we go. But we will do this less to do with the actual fields we put in and more of the structure of how they show up. So we're still going to be working in those repeats, but this time we're going to say this is a 4-sided sign so that I lied. This is a 2-sided sign. We've got a front and a back to all of these panels. And then on each of those sides, we have up to 4 panels that can be included. Within each of those panels, we have room for 4 rows of information, so 4 repeats. And then within each of those rows, we have all of those fields that we can identify here we'll do a symbol 1, symbol 2, and symbol 3. I know that there's 4, but we'll just keep it a little simple here. And then finally our destination. And so if we were to look at this sign, let's go through the process of actually setting this up. So this is two panels that we have, and they're both going to be double-sided. So we don't know what the back side is going to say, but if we come and create a post, we now have the interface for all of this information to be there. And sorry, it's going to take a second here. Right at the 2 o'clock mark, everything that we've broken down for the fields is now just contained in a different structure. So it's all the same fields that we would have set up, but now we are saying, okay, we have 2 sides, and in each of those sides, we have up to 4 panels that we can include.